Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Thank you for joining us as we explore the challenges facing London's energy infrastructure and future demand, along with possible solutions for Londoners. Our focus today is to discuss the technical and regulatory environment, as well as to explore alternatives, such as heat networks and microgrids, to address capacity issues. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone to please switch their phones to silent mode. I also ask that members and guests position their electronic devices away from their microphones. Also, please adjust your microphone so that you can be heard clearly. If you need to adjust your microphone, please remember to lift it from the base. Members of the public are encouraged to follow @London Assembly on X and use the hashtag #AssemblyPlanning for this meeting. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Sal Fazal, to confirm any apologies and provide an update on attendance for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies have been received, and in accordance with Standing Orders 2.4 and 8.2, Assembly Member Wilson will be attending today's meeting remotely as an observer. Thank you.
Can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Assembly Member Murma?
My husband works for Ofgem.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 9th of June and 26th of June 2025? Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Can I ask the committee to note the action taken by me under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's response to the Mayor of London's consultation on Towards a New London Plan? Can I ask the committee to note the responses received from the Mayor of London to the committee's outputs as set out in the agenda report? Can I ask the committee to note that formal approval will be sought from the GLA Oversight Committee to engage a scientific advisor to support the work of the Planning and Regeneration Committee over the period of September to November 2025. We now move on to our main item of business, a discussion on whether London's energy grid can support new housing and economic growth. Today's discussion will be split into 2 panels. I'd like to welcome our guests for the first panel. In the chamber, we have Peter Bingham, Chief Engineer at the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, Ofgem. Julian Leslie, Director of Strategic Energy Planning at the National Energy System Operator. Andrew Roper, Director of Distribution System Operations, Scottish and Southern Electricity. And John Twomey, Director of Customer and Network Development, National Grid. Thank you all for joining us. I will ask the first question to the panel, and it is addressed to you all. It is, what is your assessment of the current energy situation in West London? And do you have confidence that the system will be able to manage expectations of future housing, economic and infrastructure growth? We'll start with John and then move across.
Thank you for the question. Well, first and foremost, in West London, we have seen an unprecedented demand for new connections, and specifically a lot of data centres looking to connect, as well as other demand coming into the area. More nationally, we have seen that picture across the board. So from our sort of licensed area in England and Wales, there is obviously a national picture on a huge demand for connections, and there's a big programme of work across the industry in terms of connection reform, looking to look at that. West London itself is quite specific in terms of the nature of the types of connections that customers are looking to have. So there has been a huge amount of work, both from an investment proposition, so from National Grid's perspective, we're doing a huge amount of investment, a £1 billion set of investment across London from Wimbledon to Crayford. Additionally, on top of that, we have worked really collaboratively across the industry looking at short-term ways in which we can alleviate those pressure on the grid, such as a ramping solution that we've seen, a new capacity product that has been launched over the last couple of years. And going forward, we have a huge offering in terms of a £35 billion investment proposition as part of our price control process that we're in discussions with Ofgem about in terms of that process. And specifically for the area of London, there's a huge undertaking in terms of that investment. So that, coupled with the level of change that we also need to see through policy and regulatory frameworks, there is a kind of a real direction around what needs to be done, but undoubtedly there's work across the industry to obviously conclude many of those things.
Yes, so good afternoon. Just to position Scottish and Southern electricity networks, we're like the A and B roads between ourselves and National Grid. So John Twomey's there is like the motorway, and we take the electricity from 132,000 volts down to homes and businesses. In terms of your question regarding capacity available, I just want to reassure everybody that there is actually plenty of capacity available in the network in the short term. The capacity issues which have arisen are really about the future connections queue and the way that that is dealt with. That is dealt with on a first come, first served basis. John mentioned the data centres, for example. These are very large loads which could not have been predicted back in 2022 when we put our price controls together. And those, in terms of connection capacity queue, have led to the headline. So there is capacity available, and given that it's actually these theoretical connections queue that have been causing the issues. John mentioned about how we've been working with our National Grid colleagues and NESO to look at innovative ways to deal with that, how we get people connected in the short term. So that led to the 1 megawatt ramping approach, which John referred to, which has allowed 7,800 new homes to get connected and has dealt with the majority of those developments. So the remaining issues tend to be the very large loads, such as data centres, that we are still working on and need wider strategic investment, which we're also putting forward. Probably a good point to get Julian's view.
Great, thanks. So the National Energy System Operator, so we sort of sit to the heart of the energy sector trying to sort of bring these plans together. And we've only created just under a year ago as part of the Electricity System Operators. We became owned by government but independent from government. So it's our role to sort of look at this whole system, and really now as the NESO, the National Energy System Operator, really looking into the future. So recognising the challenges we've got around connections and connection reform, we're leading a massive piece of work with Andrew and John and other members across the industry and the regulator to sort out these speculative demand and generation connections in the queue. So on generation, it's been well known for a long time. There's way more people wanting to connect to the grid system than we need, and reform is going to solve that. What we've also seen in the last probably last 12 months, is that the massive growth of data centres. So nationally, there's now 65,000 megawatts of data centres that are looking for connection to the grid. The most ambitious sort of DSIT strategy gets to about 8,000 to 10,000 megawatts. So already we're seeing a 6 to 7 times oversubscription into the connection queue for these data centres. So we're working with Ofgem and with government and our fellow network colleagues just to work out, well, what can we do, what can we learn from the generation side, and can we apply that to something on the demand side, so actually we can see which projects are ready and which ones are needed, then they're the ones that can get their space in the queue and strip out the others. The other good example of this is that there's 70,000 megawatts of batteries in the queue by 2030, and we need 28,000 as a nation. So again, 40 to 50,000 megawatts of batteries are going to be stripped out of the queue, which will then start to relieve the capacity constraint both for Andrew and for John as we move into the future. So there's huge growth and huge work going on in this area for stuff that's going to connect in the next couple of years. But as Andrew said, the short-term fixes, they're in place today and delivering real benefit.
Good afternoon. So I'm here from Ofgem. Ofgem's the energy regulator. Our job is to protect the interests of current and future consumers, and we also have duties around enabling net zero and economic growth. So we absolutely recognise the need to upgrade the energy infrastructure, both in West London and much more widely across our nation, to support net zero ambitions, to support economic growth and indeed to support housing and other demand growth. But we as a regulator, we don't plan and build energy infrastructure. Our job is to enable the companies to my right, in terms of the system operator planning the system and Andrew and John, whose organisation build that infrastructure. So we provide the funding through what we call price control mechanisms in order to enable these companies to build that infrastructure, and we hold them to account for delivery of it. I will talk a little bit about the regulatory reforms. I think John and my colleagues here have mentioned in terms of connection reform, so dealing with this whole issue of speculative generation and demand in the queue and reforming those arrangements. And we've approved the new connections regime that have been put forward by the system operator. And indeed creating the regulatory framework around strategic planning, so moving to this world where we strategically plan our energy system right into the future, and then we can plan the networks to enable that future, and the networks can get on and build it rather than just respond, I guess, to connection applications coming at them. So, from my perspective, there is a need for infrastructure to deal with these challenges, but we as the regulator are absolutely there to ensure that the companies can fund and deliver that infrastructure.
Thank you all very much. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Good morning to you. Hello, John. You spoke about a £35 billion investment. Is that an idea? Is it pending? Is the money set aside? What's the status of that investment?
Yeah, so the £35 billion investment that I talked about is part of our new price control proposals that we're currently going through with Ofgem. Just to set the scene on that, we work under a regulatory funding deal which lasts 5 years. The next 5 years is from April 2026 through to March 31. The £35 billion is a plan that we've put forward with Ofgem through that process. So we've submitted that plan. That plan is going through its due challenge with Ofgem. So we've just gone through a process called draft determinations. And by December this year, it will get to final determinations where there'll be a decision around the plan. So the plan sets out the scale of investment that we feel that we need to make on the system. So the £35 billion equates to 35 gigawatts of generation going onto transmission systems supporting the distribution network owners, and equally 19 GVA of demand on new connections as well. So it is a investment proposition kind of fit for the next 5 years and the ambitions that we need to make both from a decarbonisation but also supporting growth both nationally and regionally across the country.
Just a tiny question. I'm trying to understand where that 35 billion will come from. Who stumps up that cash?
Well, ultimately, the £35 billion is within a process where Ofgem would ultimately need to agree to the plan, and by agreeing to the plan, agree to the funding. And within the price control, there's certain things that you agree up front in terms of funding, and there's certain provisions within the funding deal itself that mean that there's reopeners, so you agree those things as you go through the 5 years. In terms of financing the money will be financed by National Grid as a private organisation, but the funding and the allowance for the funding comes through that discussion and agreement with Ofgem.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Boff.
Can I clarify from Ofgem's perspective? So yes, John's correct. We are currently reviewing their business plans. We will reach our final determinations on their allowances. Ultimately, they will raise their capital, as any companies do, through the market. But that capital is paid back through the price control, effectively recovered through consumer bills. A lot of that capital investment is recovered over a number of years, but ultimately it is added to consumer bills. So one of our interests in reviewing these proposals is making sure that consumers are getting value for money for the investment that they are making.
Mr. Leslie, you said that there's 70 megawatts of batteries coming online. Who owns those? Who will own?
Batteries, there's 70,000 megawatts in the queue. So they're owned by private investors who have made the case to make an investment in the batteries. Now, there's been this huge oversubscription in battery connections, along with many others as well, but batteries in particular. And with the Clean Power Action Plan that was signed off by government a year ago, we're now delivering a connection process that will ensure that the level of generation, including batteries, is that level that gets connected to the grid. So it means that we're going to avoid the position where we've got an oversubscription of batteries taking up capacity on the system but not adding value to the system, and that is what connection reform in a nutshell is trying to do.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Assemblymember Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I'm following up really on the first question about the assessment of the energy situation and capacity constraints. So anyone who feels they've got something to contribute to this, then please do come in. But what I'm interested in is exactly when it was identified, because obviously regular forecasting is done. So forecasting will have been done maybe 2021 to early 2022. Were the future capacity constraints identified at that time?
In terms of Scottish and Southern electricity networks, we look at the future energy scenarios, distribution scenarios, which are based on the national grid, actually NESO scenarios now. Looking out to the future, they look at the projections for things such as heat pumps, electric vehicles. Within that analysis, we have plenty of capacity for all of the types of things which are foreseen within those. And that has a degree of there are different scenarios within that that you're able to work within the boundaries. The issue is that these very large point loads are very much larger than electric vehicles and heat pumps in the sum of the volume. So that's had a very big impact on the overall requirement.
Yeah, absolutely. So when did that become clear? Sorry, I think, did you say over the last few months? Just want to be clear.
No, this is back in 2022, 2023, and hence why we've been working with our colleagues on how to address that.
Okay, and so given that, and given that this has obviously changed the situation and meant that you've had to sort of bring in some mitigation that you've started to talk about, how likely is that something else will change, something else that's not on the horizon, maybe in another area of the network, will arrive that, again, is not currently part of the forecasting? So that's a little bit crystal ball, isn't it? But do you know what I mean? We're trying to work out what's the likelihood of this changing again.
So I think one of the reasons why the National Energy System Operator was established was to create this government-owned independent body to have a much greater sort of insight and in-depth view as to what's happening. So not only do we strategically plan sort of the top-down transmission motorways of the system, but we've also got a role in the regional energy strategic plan, working with local distribution companies, both gas and electricity, and potential hydrogen and heat networks, to try and pull that whole energy system plan together in a way that's never been done before. So I've got a team now developing, working with local area authorities, working with metro mayors, just trying to understand what is the ambition and what are the options. Yes, electrification is obviously one big option, but there are other options and alternatives as well. So trying to get on the ground much more to get a better understanding of what is the local ambition, what are those local strategies that meets the needs of the particular region, so we're different in different parts of the nation. In terms of what the data centres, I think, just the scale of it, and as we said already, the scale of what the connection queue is showing isn't real.
Yeah.
And what we need to do, working with the regulator and government, is to work out what is real in that queue, what is the nation's ambition for data centres to support the economic growth, but actually 65,000 megawatts is way too much. And if we got down to the 8 or 10 strategically placed across the system, then actually everybody can have the capacity to connect what they want. So we've been asked by DSIT to find 5 AI sort of growth zones across Britain. So where's the capacity today? Where can get that capacity be connected? Working with John and our fellow colleagues in Scotland to say, well, where are those pockets of capacity now where we can start to concentrate these growth zones for data centres? And that means, of course, this whole north of London, west of London sort of gold rush to find capacity, they're just not needed. We're just in this weird position where the planning that Andrew and I and John do is based on future-looking scenarios, but the connection process, when you apply today, you're stuck in a queue with everything ahead of you assumed to be connecting, And that's what we're changing with connection reform.
Thanks. I mean, I think we're going to come back again to ask specifically more about the data centres and the impact on that. But just to taking into account what you're saying in terms of the measures to more accurately line up what's actually needed rather than the sort of predictions, are you confident that the forecasting of that and then being able to manage that is better than it was a few years ago?
I mean, I think whenever you get...
You probably would say that.
Well, whenever you get disruptive technologies, though, who knew that data centres were even a thing 3 years ago, 4 years ago? What I do believe, though, going forward with the role of NESO now in this longer-term strategic energy planning, working very closely with people like yourselves to really understand what is required on the ground. Hopefully we can start to get on the front foot of these. But also the connection reform process, now that's established, that is the ongoing connection process. We will never get to this tenfold oversubscription in the queue again. Because we've got a gated process where you can show your interest, but it's only when you're ready and needed that you go through the gate into the next stage of the process. So I would hope that once all this reform is done, well, I hope anyway, it's been a lot of work to get here, so I hope that actually this is a long-lasting solution where actually we make the connections for those projects which are needed and are ready.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Back to you, Chair.
Assemblymember Lord Bailey.
Morning, Julian. You seem to suggest that not you as an individual, you as an organisation, would determine where these data centres are going to be. But isn't that the function of the market, or is it a partnership, or you're just going to say, look, you're going to put it here and you're going to like it?
So it's a combination. I guess what we're trying to do with the network is to get much more of a centrally planned strategic set of investments. It takes, John, 10 to 15 years to build a new overhead line. So if you want that new capacity, you need to have started in 2015 to have that capacity available today. What we're trying to do is look now, because the data centres and that other strategic demand needs connections much more quickly. And obviously there are pockets across Britain where there is capacity available today where people can get a quicker connection. That's not to say that the market can't be free to decide where it wants to connect, but then it's going to be stuck in a queue or waiting for long-term investments that may or may not be coming over the hill. So it's trying to find that balance between market-led plus also more centrally planned. And we've got a process, I believe, with strategic energy planning and the regional energy strategic plans that actually do that good balance between the two, taking those inputs and infeeds as to what is required from the market, and then working with my colleagues here across the network companies to find out where that capacity is today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Garbett.
Hello. I'm going to ask Julian this question, but others may want to add in or have a view. So, I mean, you've mentioned data centres already this morning, and it's the significant concentration of data centres along the M4 corridor is often to blame for the electricity capacity constraints facing West London. But there are data centres obviously everywhere, including across other parts of London. So we just wanted to know why the problem is particularly concentrated in West London. I think you're the right person to ask, but it might be other people too.
So I think it's back to the previous question that this is a developer-led process. If you've got a bit of land and you think you can attract a data centre, then that piece of land is now very valuable. There's no strategic need for it. There's no volume driver for that volume of data centre connections. And that's why, as we've seen on the generation side and on batteries, that a lot of these projects are paper projects. They're not real projects. But when they apply to either John or to Andrew to take capacity from the grid, they're all treated equally. They're all treated as certain as the next. Hence why we're doing connection reform, so actually we can find a process by which we can test whether those projects are real and if they're needed against some nationally agreed sort of set of capacities.
So it's to do with how the processes influence what's been able to develop there rather than the data centres themselves? So
the market-led approach for data centres is that people are using their parcel of land, trying to upscale that piece of land. But the volume of that is so great that it's far more than is ever required. So that's on the one side from a developer's point of view, looking for the opportunity to increase the value of their piece of land. From a grid connection point of view, we're stuck in a process whereby everybody's as certain as everybody else, and therefore we just stack them up, even though we all know 65,000 megawatts of data centres in Britain is not something that we would ever need. The total maximum demand in Britain is only 50,000 megawatts. So you're more than doubling the size of our demand of the entire nation just in the queue for data centres, which just isn't credible. And it's just not something that we or DCIT or DESNES believe is right. So that's why we're working on reform, to find a way to say, well, actually, which one of those are ready, and therefore which are needed, and then there's others which are clogging the queue and creating capacity that could be available for other industrial decarbonisation or other growth strategies. That capacity then becomes available for them, rather than being bogged down with these paper projects for data centres.
Thank you. And then is there anything specific that you wanted to add about West London, just that hasn't been said already?
My understanding is that there's a number of factors coming together in West London. There was previously connection capacity, but that's been used up in theory in terms of this connection queue, but it's also the proximity to communications infrastructure and the City of London. There's a lot of things to do from data centres in terms of latency of communications. So I understand that West London is a particularly attractive area due to that coming together of the communications infrastructure, and they also need quite a lot of water for cooling, and there's a lot of water available in the area as well.
If I can as well, just from a transmission perspective, there's two main factors, I think, particularly in this area, that's affecting particularly sort of connection timescales. So for someone to need a connection, they need capacity in the wider system, so sort of the overhead lines, and particularly for West London, for instance, the lead times are affected because of the need for a new overhead line that's required in the area, and particularly like connection reform, for instance, will undergo sort of an assessments about the need for that new overhead line with the change in background that Julian still talked about. The other part to talk about is the fact that physically each of these projects looking to connect needs a physical point of connection, and therefore it is also driving the need for extension to existing substations or the need for new substations, for instance. So the likes of our new transmission substation going in at Uxbridge Moor is part of that. So it's essentially got the characteristics today of needing both. But as we go through connection reform, particularly from the wider system perspective, we will hope that the recommendation and the conclusion of that process is obviously beneficial in terms of future connection timescales.
Thanks. That's really insightful. Did you want to come in quickly?
I was just going to say, as a regulator, we're very alert to this issue with data centres. There's significant volumes, as Julian has outlined. We will be publishing an open letter in terms of our stance on this issue. We're working with NISA and government in terms of how we address this going forward, and considering policy options that we may need to bring in to help manage the situation.
And so when was that going to be? Sorry, when you said there's a letter?
It's imminent.
Imminent.
But yes, I'll be happy to share that with you when it's published.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
My question was answered. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Boff.
Yes, Mr. Roper, you said that the one MVA ramping had been largely successful in supporting smaller schemes, but we have heard evidence as a committee that there is the larger schemes, the more strategic schemes, are being held up, leading NASO to suspend new connection applications for a few months. What reassurance can we have that those larger schemes can be developed, bearing in mind London over the next few years needs 880,000 new homes?
So just to clarify, we haven't paused connections for demand. That's only for generation whilst we're sorting out connection reform. So demand customers can still carry on applying for connections as they always have done. So I'm not sure where that message has come from, because that is not the case. In terms of the future, I'll let Andrew come in a moment, but what we've done as part of the development of the Regional Energy Strategic Plan, we wrote to all interested stakeholders in an open letter earlier this summer to request for information on strategic investment that could be required in the next 5 to 10 years. So we've received over 1,500 notices of intent or requests for that strategic investment need. So we're just going through that process now, with the idea being that by the time we get to the end of the year, and Andrew's starting on his next price control, that this whole list of strategic investments could be part of that. So where it is genuinely strategic, where it is genuinely driven probably by more than one developer, and we need to upgrade into a region or an area, and again, working with Andrew, we can identify what they are. Working with Pete then in the price control, they should then get early funding so we can accelerate the deployment of these. But that doesn't withstand the normal process that Andrew would run on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so just to confirm, so demand connections are still fully open for application to ourselves. The way that the ramping solution works is that it allows people to ramp up their demand over time, and we've already managed that interface in our future scenarios with NESO and National Grid, so that has already been accounted for. In terms of the larger connections, Julian's mentioned the Regional Energy Strategic Planning process. Also, from a Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks point of view, we've put together strategic development plans where we've looked out on the requirements out to 2050, taking into account all the general load growth from electric vehicles, heat pumps, but also where we know about larger developments. And we're sharing that with the regional energy strategic planners so that we can coordinate all the future reinforcement required with National Grid. So we've got a bottom-up approach from ourselves and a top-down approach from NESO and National Grid to join that all together.
I think nobody underestimates your job, Mr. Leslie, in anticipating what demand there's going to be. I mean, planners, when they grant planning permissions, they don't know when or if the development's going to take place. Would it be helpful if planning applications were shorter and the permission was over a narrower period, so forcing developers to develop in a shorter space of time?
I mean, I think from our point of view, certainty is a thing that drives the investment. So if we knew for sure that something was coming, then obviously that helps my colleagues here with the physical network to build it, and they'd know they're building it for real. It also helps the regulator because actually we're not going to get stranded assets which the consumer has funded, which are then left underutilised, which is why our strategic network investment processes are looking to find that evidence base. So this isn't, we're not going to suggest to Andrew he builds a strategic investment for a single developer, but if it's into a region where there's multiple developers, and actually when you look at the will of the local authority or the local council or the local mayors, whatever, and there's those mechanisms in place so we can get that confidence that something is going to happen. We're not quite sure what's going to happen, but something is going to happen. Then that's when we'll start working with Andrew and the team to work out, well, actually, if this were to happen, what are those technical solutions? When we need to start building on those? We then make a recommendation to the price control, and then the regulator, if they approve with the criteria, then they would then grant the allowances for then Andrew to start building the assets.
So it's fair to say any measure that improves certainty in the process would help.
Is good.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. So we've been working with many of the local authorities on their local area energy plans, and SSEN have created a tool called Lenser, which allows people to put in their information, mainly I'm talking about local authorities now, so that allows to share forward information with ourselves. I think the most important thing is when we're planning these strategic developments and the planning authorities, that there's engagement with our whole system team that we've got specifically set up, and that information is put into that tool, so we've got full visibility, and we can also share that up the way with Julian's team.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Moama.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. My first question is to all of you. You've all kind of touched on the fact that around the capacity around data centres, and we know that energy demands from them are growing rapidly, in part due to growth in AI. I think you mentioned 60,000 megawatts, if I'm understanding. Okay, good. And there is tension and competition for capacity from housing growth and data centres. So my question to all of you is what steps, and perhaps in addition to what you've said, I know you've covered some of this, but what steps are you taking to ensure that grid and reinforcement work has enough headroom built into it to deal with this new demand, and what other sources? And if I could just start with you, Peter, just you mentioned a letter in response to my colleague, Assemblymember Garbett. I just wonder if there is anything that might be shareable, whether it talks about that capacity, kind of the direction of where that might be, or whether we need to wait as a committee for that information. But just more broadly, yeah, what capacity and headroom is being built into the system. So perhaps we'll start with you and then work down the panel.
Okay, yes, we are publishing an open letter to I guess, put out the options, I guess, in terms of how we might deal with this issue. I think, all options are on the table, really. We do need a strategic approach. I've heard different figures. I've heard figures of up to 120 gigawatts worth of data centres in the demand connection queue. That's like 4 times the amount of demand on the whole system today. Which of those are real? Which of those are actually going to proceed and are needed? And how do my colleagues here plan and then deliver a network to accommodate both that demand, housing demand, demand for economic growth and for net zero. We've talked today on the panel about strategic planning. We created this whole regulatory environment for strategic planning, which is now in delivery by the NESO, both the strategic, spatial kind of energy planning at the national level and the regional energy planning at the local level. And those regional plans should factor in local authority plans, engage with businesses and communities to understand their long-term energy needs. And then it's for the network's design, the network into the future, and sort of trigger anticipatory investment. The idea is to try and get ahead of the need, understand the future need and invest ahead of that need rather than playing catch up as we seem to have found ourselves in certain situations at the moment. So we're very keen on making this whole concept of strategic planning work to ensure that future needs are met by the networks. But yes, we are publishing an open letter. That this is an issue that is surfaced. The connection reform was very much focused on generation, but we now need to think about how we manage this strategic demand issue.
Thank you. Julian?
I mean, not much more to say than that, really, other than, historically, we've invested in time with the need. And what we're looking to do now is try and get, as Peter said, to get on the front foot and look to the future and to make sure the investment decisions are made today are in the context of where we're heading for 2050 and beyond. That's not been the case to date. So I've got real confidence that with connection reform, with the establishment of NESO and the strategic energy plans that we have, that actually we'll be able to get on the front foot and working with our network colleagues to give that clarity on investment so we're not, so the capacity is there and available when it's needed into the future.
Yeah, in the West London area specifically, the current demand is about 1,200 megawatts. We have issued 27 projects to be built by 2030 as part of the Ofgem price control reopener. So it's called the load-related reopener, which is to support capacity slightly ahead of need. Those 27 projects will release another 960 megawatts, so nearly double the current capacity of that by 2030. And that will be a total investment of £400 million. We will be submitting that to Ofgem in October of this year as part of a wider reopener, and we'll be looking for a favourable response with regards to those investments. But those investments have already been put out and are being designed, and some of them are already being built by our framework contractors. So we're already taking that action proactively ahead of receiving the funding.
Thanks. And John, if you had anything to add?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So as I talked about earlier, getting the right investment plan for the future is obviously really important. So the 35 billion that I've talked about previously, that is a plan based on stakeholder feedback. So there's been a huge amount of stakeholders that's been fed into that process at both transmission and distribution level. There's also a plan in which it isn't just about connecting the projects that we know that will connect in the next 5 years. It is about future-proofing, making sure that investment decisions for the system enable additional capacity going onto the system, both on the wider system and also at substations. So that is kind of looking to connect, as I've talked about, 19 GVA of demand and around 8.2 GVA of demand connections, specifically in the London area. So investment is really, really important in getting that right and making sure our decisions are economic and efficient, and the right things going forward for the system are obviously key. Underpinned by that, as the panel have said, is obviously the fact that the strategic direction of decisions that we need to make, so the work going on with the regional energy strategic plans and that laddering into national plans, so we're making sure that we have an early need and early clarity, which kind of informs those plans, and we can get on the front foot. And then the last parts to say is obviously the kind of need for connection reform to run this year with the programme that we're in, and therefore looking at specifically what for strategic demand, what else is required. And as part of that, it's also really important that the work that we've been doing supporting government about the connection accelerator service as well. So where there are specific strategic demand projects that are seen important, whether there is any future regulatory change to enable projects of certain characteristics to have a different service related to them. So that'd be the key things.
Thank you. My next question is for John, Andrew and Julian, although you're very welcome to come in, Peter, if you want to. Sorry, I feel very exclusionary. It's been mentioned that there are 5 AI growth zones to be cited in the country, and we know that data centres consume about 2.5% of the UK's electricity, and the sector's demand is expected to rise considerably, fourfold by 2030, which is not that far away. Do you think, how do you think the grid, or can you let us know how the grid is preparing to accommodate that increase, especially when we're about to lose capacity in nuclear? It's going to be retired, and if you have any concerns about capacity or resilience, perhaps we'll start this way.
Well, I should start.
Oh, sure.
So part of our work with particular focus on 2030 was when the new government was established a year ago, just over. They asked, one of our first activities was to create advice as to what it would take to be able to get a clean power system by 2030, which is robust, reliable, secure, and meets the decarbonisation target. So we created that plan and gave that to government on the 5th of November last year. And then by the end of December, the government had turned that around to the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan. And it's that Clean Power 2030 Action Plan which lists all of the generation that we need in order to meet security of supply, in order to meet the predicted demand growth, which is about 10% of national demand from where we were last year to 2030. So there is enough generation in that plan. The network, there is 88 very large network infrastructure upgrades required, which John and his fellow colleagues in Scotland are underway and developing, and government is monitoring every 2 months the progress against those network investments. Connection reforms we talked about a lot is running in parallel, and the need, we talk about connections having been ready and being needed. The need comes from the capacities that are in the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan. So there's capacities in there for 49 gigawatts of solar, 43 to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, etc., etc. So by capacity and by region, those capacities are broken down, which gives real clarity to John and to Andrew as they're looking to what is expected on the network. They actually have that great clarity and great sense. And because it's in the government's action plan for 2030, then we've got the backing of the Clean Power Unit under Chris Stark and Ed Miliband. So we have everything we need in order to ensure that we can move on this decarbonisation journey to ensure a safe, secure and low-cost system for the future.
So given the scale of the data centres in terms of their demand, the majority of them need to connect at the transmission level, although some of them do come to the distribution level to try and connect at the 132 kV level. In terms of confidence for supply of generation meeting that need, in terms of our role as Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, we have an allocation from Julian in terms of solar and batteries that we need to connect to the network, and our initial analysis of that show that that allocation, which is from people commercially connecting to us, should be able to be met. So that's our role in providing that capacity. Ultimately, the majority of those will connect at the transmission level in terms of data centres.
Yeah, and just to add from a transmission perspective, I mean, Julian's obviously correct in what he's saying in terms of the journey that this has been through. At the point where we are in the programme at the minute, there is obviously the need for projects to be sited in the right place as well, close to energy infrastructure or where energy infrastructure is in development. So connection reform is a big part of that. We are obviously at part of the process where we're still waiting for the conclusions of which projects are essentially at gate 2 to get a firm connection offer. And the locational aspect of those projects is really, really important to make sure that that aligns well with the regional plans for where the network is going to be upgraded. So there's a lot of work going on across transmission, distribution and with NESO around that programme of work. And then specifically to your question about AI growth zones, there's also been a huge amount of work around looking at options for where AI growth zones could be, current infrastructure that's available. And obviously there is a relationship between the siting of generation assets and also demand assets to make sure that's the right thing for the overall network as well.
Julian, just on the point on AI growth zones, do you know when that is going to be reported on, where those locations will be? And is that work being done in conjunction with, say, the AI firms?
So it's a DSIT-led process. We're asking a very specific question they've asked us. But in doing so, we are also engaging with the Amazons and the Google and the AWS or whatever to understand what their needs are. Because as John said earlier, communications and water is a key driver for them as well. My sort of counter to that is it's cheaper to put a fibre optic cable in than it is to put a 400 kV transmission line. So we're just going through that sort of process to understand, and for them to understand our constraints and for us to understand their constraints. And together that will all come together. But it is a DSIT-led process, so I can't comment on timings.
Thank you. Assemblymember Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Before I come on to the question that I've got listed to ask, I'd like to pick up, sort of follow up on that previous exchange, and particularly, Julian, you're talking about a plan for clean power by 2030 and saying that the plan has said what is required, and I think the words you said give clarity on what is expected. But given that 2030 is not that long away, do you really have clarity on what can actually be delivered to make that happen? Are we being hamstrung by kind of artificially rapid kind of hurtling towards net zero before it's necessary? And is that creating additional problems and cost with actually just the basic job of keeping the lights on in the first place?
So that's a really good question. In terms of creating the Clean Power 2030 plan and advice that we provide to government, we wanted it to be challenging but credible. And as you rightly say, with only 4 or 5 years to go, unless something of this scale is already in the planning process at some level, then it's not going to happen by 2030. So what we've actually done is stripped out, taken away a whole load of work that was planned to be done through the markets, the market-led approach, and said actually some of that isn't required. And actually we're giving clarity to Andrew and to John and their organisations to really focus on the assets that are actually required for 2030, rather than before the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan. We had a queue that was 4 or 5 times oversubscribed with no real clarity as to what was needed for 2030. So actually, rather than hurtling headlong into an overbuild and an over sort of preparedness for 2030, what we've done is actually made it really clear, provided that clarity for the network companies and for the investors in the generation side as well, to get that clarity that if they get built, they will be needed. And therefore providing much needed clarity to the system for more of a central planning function that we have within NESO.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see in a few years' time. The question that I've actually got in front of me now then is to John, I think primarily, and this is talking about or asking about improvements in the transmission network and in particular the grid supply points, and when this improvement work, reinforcement work, in West London is likely to be complete? Because if the sort of date that's been quoted of 2037, that seems a very long way away, and completing work by then, how does that help deliver the capacity that's required in the much shorter sort of timescale?
Yeah, so the 2037 date that you've talked about, that is currently the lead time associated with the new overhead line that is currently needing to be developed and delivered from the west of England into sort of the west of London as part of the reinforcements required, given all of the connections that we've seen in that area. Connection reform will play quite a vital part of looking to see if changes are required around that overhead line. So big changes in the generation background, for instance, and changes that we could see at demand level might mean that there's a need for just reconductoring of overhead lines rather than new overhead line, but that is yet to be seen as we go through that process. Specifically for the substations themselves, there are multiple delivery dates for different substations in the west of London. One of the biggest new substations that we are currently constructing on the ground today is Uxbridge Moor, which is forecast to be delivered in 2029. So really connection reform will play a pivotal part in looking to see if the wider system constraints that we see today can be brought in with the current timescales that we see for some of the substations work, and that's obviously a big part of connection reform.
Sure. So some could come on stream sooner than that, and that would be helpful. But beyond that, are there things that can be done to accelerate the wider, more kind of large-scale work?
Yeah, so I mean, just to probably touch on a couple of other bits. Obviously, the overhead line timescales is the critical path for delivery of a big new asset onto the system. But undoubtedly, underneath all of this, there's work that's going on around how rules can be changed to create more capacity on the system. Equally, how innovation can play a key role. So within National Grid, we're installing equipment onto our system that can provide additional capacity into the overhead line circuits, so dynamic line rating, for instance. So there's a whole host of different products that can be deployed. It's just looking at the characteristics of the part of the network and what can be brought forward. So we are focused on all of those things, as well as the future infrastructure about how we put more capacity in the system when that's required.
Thank you very much.
Assembly Member Boff.
Mr. Bingham, how will Ofgem integrate local development plans into investment decisions for DNOs under the 2028 price control framework?
So I spoke earlier on, we created the regulatory framework for strategic planning and the concepts of the Regional Energy System Planner, which is now in delivery with the NESO. So they will work with local actors, local authorities, in terms of developing those regional strategic energy plans. There will be a transitional plan which effectively will feed the upcoming electricity distribution price control process. So that will set the energy background. It's a provisional background that they will use to put forward their long-term investment plans. So again, I talk about anticipated investment based on long-term strategic plans. So yeah, those rests will enable Andrew and other DNOs to develop a long-term strategic network plan that will be that will be submitted as part of the next price control process that's coming next year.
So will you be able to provide stronger incentives through the price control mechanisms for investments in grid capacity in specific places where it's needed, such as in West London?
We expect that the companies do absolutely come up with network plans that meet those capacity needs. In terms of incentives, we already have incentives for the transmission organisations to build some of the investment needed for Clean Power 2030. So there's incentives to deliver that earlier. There are penalties potentially for delays. We will follow that through in terms of the next transmission price control for connections. So again, a sort of carrot and stick approach. And, we'll take that sort of concept forward when we design the electricity distribution price controls. Again, we very, very much favour incentives to encourage the companies to deliver at pace. And
do you anticipate that those, this is going to come in 2028, isn't it, these price control mechanisms? So what consultation will take place beforehand, will you be doing about those price controls?
We've already consulted on the design of that electricity distribution price control. We'll be publishing a document very shortly that sets out the framework that will run for that price control period. And that will enable then the distribution companies to assemble their business plans that will be submitted later next year for our consideration. So we're effectively already in the process of designing the policy framework for ED3. We'll be publishing our proposals very shortly.
Are current networks adapting quickly enough to energy transition, do you think? And especially with regard to decentralised energy sources?
There's been a huge amount of change in the sector, the creation of the distribution system operators. Andrew can talk a lot about those, but then, the whole kind of concept of strategic planning, rather than, the age-old sort of just-in-time type of approach, there's a complete transformation and a recognition of the need to think in advance and strategically plan and build for the future. It's changing.
Have you been given an opportunity to feed into the next London plan, and would you welcome that?
I guess that's a matter for the regional planners.
Yeah, so we've been working since we got the commission to do this work in April of this year. We've been working with local actors and trying to understand what is happening in the regions. So we will be consulting on the inputs that will go to Andrew and the other distribution companies later this year, ahead of then us putting our final recommendation into both the companies and to Ofgem to say, this is what we've heard in the regions, this is how we see the development going in those regions, and therefore this is our sort of proposal as to the input information. But also those strategic investments I spoke of earlier will be also identifying where we believe that there is genuine consumer interest and benefit in strategically investing in the network. And that will be consulted upon in the next couple of months.
It was a key design intention when we put together the whole RESP concept that effectively the strategic planners would engage with local authorities, local actors to understand those local needs and bake those into those plans.
But directly Ofgem itself wouldn't get involved in that consultation?
No, that's for the NESO who are in delivery. They will do that engagement. And if they're not, then they've got us to answer to.
It gives us a lot of clarity. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
You'll be pleased to know that we've already looked at what the requirements are from our network at a strategic level out to 2050 and specifically focusing in out to 2032. We need to put together our draft numbers for our business plan by June next year, which is the reason that we've published the strategic development plans, which we are also sharing with the regional energy strategic planner, so that your local authorities can feed back on those, and then we would expect to get the funding for those things which are needed within that time period from Ofgem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
My question is to Peter. The so-called Social Market Foundation has found that powering a UK data centre is more expensive than in many European countries and 4 times more expensive than in the US. Just why is that the case, and what reforms do you think are needed to ensure that London and the UK more broadly remain competitive in the industries of the future, like artificial intelligence?
Okay, so in terms of energy costs, it's well understood that The price of energy is driven by wholesale costs of energy, particularly the cost of gas, which is significantly more expensive than before the pandemic. That's driving energy costs significantly, and the intent of government is to wean ourselves off imports of gas and very much push the renewable power agenda. And the belief is that renewable power will bring prices down in the longer term. Of course, there's the cost of the network associated with accessing that renewable power. But yeah, the government sort of Clean Power 2030 sort of push, we'll see a lot more renewable power and reduced dependency on expensive gas imports. So, we would hope that in the longer term, energy prices come down, making the UK economy more competitive.
And do you think it's a problem that we still have gas setting the price the majority of the time in terms of the electricity price?
That's the nature of the market. As we get more and more renewables on the system, that will displace gas more and more and reduce the number of times where gas is setting the marginal price. So, that's the direction of travel.
Do you think in terms of reducing the cost of, say, running a data centre, it is about reducing our reliance on gas or reducing the price of gas or both?
Sorry, could you repeat?
In terms of getting that price of electricity down, say you're powering a data centre, in terms of reducing that price and bridging that gap between some European countries and the US and the UK currently, do you think that's going to be done by removing gas from the system completely or by reducing the price of gas or by doing both?
I think both will help, indeed. Yes, if gas was cheaper, that would set a lower price. But indeed, I mean, the direction of travel is to reduce dependency on gas setting the marginal price and have more renewables on the system.
And in terms of the comparison with the US, obviously the US has used a lot of gas in their system. Yeah. Why do you think there's that price differential between the UK and the US in terms of gas price?
I guess they've got an abundance of gas through fracking in the US and at very low prices.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
Bearing in mind the costs of gas are driving up the overall cost of electricity generation, and it's because that gas we have to pay for imported gas, doesn't it make sense that we should perhaps get a bit more out of the North Sea?
I think that's a matter for government.
Well done.
Assemblymember Galbert.
Thanks. I was really positive about what you were saying about renewables and the commitment to net zero, so I really appreciate those comments. So in our first, a slightly different topic, in our first meeting, we heard about that the current allocation system incentivises applicants to overestimate their energy needs. I know that some of this has been spoken about, but I'm just going to ask the question so I get this specific answer. So yeah, overestimating their energy needs leading to unused capacity. So I just wondered if that's an issue that you're aware of and what steps are taken to release any additional unused capacity back to the grid. My question's for Andrew, but I don't know if anyone... Did you want to start? Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning.
Yeah, so as I said at the very start, the part of the issue with capacity on the system is that this is a theoretical queue with people asking for theoretical amounts of capacity that they require. Part of that is dealt with through the connections reform on the generation side. On the demand side, we are now looking, using AI techniques, at what people actually request from us in terms of their capacity request versus what they actually use. And we're now the idea behind the demand ramping was to recognise that generally people ask for a certain amount of capacity for long term, but it normally takes them quite a long time for them to actually utilise that capacity. So we're putting in place measures to request from people not only what is the ultimate capacity that they require, but also when are they likely to use that, both over the long term, over each year, but also during the week, so that we can also ask if they can provide what we call active access connections onto the network to get more people connected, but also to understand if we can manage the diversity between different types of connections so we can connect more people. So we're basically putting that information together to enable people to connect more effectively.
That's really interesting. So just on the use of the AI tool, what kind of outcomes has that had? You know, like, has it shown a real difference between kind of actual and
I mean, if
requested?
you take, for example, data centres which have initially connected up to five years ago, which tended to be a lot smaller than the ones which are now coming to connect, even over a 3 to 5 year period, the majority of those smaller data centres have only used about 60% of the capacity that they requested in that period. So we are now taking that into account into our wider planning and how we work with NESO and the demand projections that we put forward.
Yeah, and then I suppose it links to the bit that you were saying about the learning and helping people to make better. So is that helping people make better actual energy need kind of requests?
So I think that in terms of the discussions we're now having with the various providers, they all agree that that's the right thing to do, but there's also the commercial opportunity that they're perhaps signing away. So we are starting to get to the right place, but we have to remember that if you've got that connection agreed, then that is of value to you.
Yes, and just when you said that then about the 60%, does that get would the 40% get released back then? Is that how it works, or is that more complicated?
So we do not add algebraically together all of the connections that came onto the network. It would be about 5 times bigger if we do. What we're doing is we're learning from those trends in terms of the level of risk that we can take in terms of the connections and how they operate together. But we need to have data, and because these are new types of connections, we don't have the data to base it on, but we're obviously learning all of the time as we go forward.
Great, that sounds really good. Just connected to something you said earlier about working with local authorities on their energy plans, we heard again in our first panel about how local authorities and developers find it difficult to know who to talk to, like in the system, but also overwhelmed with the technical nature of the information. So we just wondered what steps are being taken to work with stakeholders to ensure that information shared with them is comprehensible and actionable. And I don't know if that links to some of the work you're doing for the energy plans.
Absolutely. So we've specifically got a whole system team within Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. We have got dedicated energy whole system coordinators who work with the local authorities. They coordinate the data both through the use of the Lenser tool, which is basically a geospatial tool which allows you to put in things that are being considered by the local authority alongside specific developments. So they coordinate those needs. We have published the output from those, which are effectively our strategic development plans, and some of the local authorities have also published their plans. We do recognise this is a bit of a learning curve for people, and some of the information we publish is quite technical. So what we're now doing is we're looking to bring up to some one-page summaries of these plans linked to a geographic map to make it more straightforward for people. So we're learning as we go along, but we've got those people available in that whole system team to do that.
So you mentioned that did you say there was a person? I didn't catch the role that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so we've got the whole system planning team within Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, and then we've got a number of net zero energy coordinators within that team who are specifically assigned to the various authorities.
And then you mentioned, I haven't caught I've tried to catch it a couple of times, the tool that you've mentioned.
Yes, it's called Lenser, which is it's the local energy net zero acceleration tool.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's available currently free of charge to all local authorities, and it allows you to try out different things which you're going to locate in your area. So you can put, for example, electric vehicle charging hubs, for example, or you're going to roll out local heat pumps in this area, for example. And what that does is coordinate the information together to understand the impact on the network.
And do you get any feedback of that from local authorities about how easy that is to
We've had extremely positive feedback, particularly from Winchester and from Oxfordshire, from some of the authorities in the West London area as well.
Great, that's really helpful. And just while I've got you, or someone else who might be relevant to answer. So in other UK cities, we've heard that there's grid capacity constraints supporting electric bus charging depots, and I just wondered if this is an issue in London.
So we've specifically been working with Transport for London about being able to make capacity available for the bus infrastructure. As you know, there are some capacity issues at the moment, but through having timed grid connections where they can charge overnight, we should be able to facilitate those connections.
Great, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Moema.
I was just going to ask if Assembly members could have a go on this tool. It sounds amazing and fascinating. And I think those of us who have constituencies would also just like to get an idea of how things are on the ground as well.
Yes. So we took a demonstration of the tool to the Houses of Parliament a couple of months ago, and we could do a similar demonstration for yourselves if you'd like us to do it.
So we've now reached the end of the first panel discussion. I'd like to thank our guests for your attendance and contributions today. We'll now take a short adjournment while we change panels. Welcome back to today's Planning and Regeneration Committee meeting. Now we will continue our discussion on whether London's energy grid can support new housing and economic growth. I would like to welcome our guests for the second panel. We have in the chamber Sophie Donaldson, London Plan Infrastructure Lead, the Greater London Authority, Alex Scragg, Development Lead, Infrastructure Coordination Service at the Greater London Authority, and Davina Wilson, Director of Projects, Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation. Joining us remotely, we have Stephen Campbell, Interim Head of Infrastructure at OPDC. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I will be asking the first question to our second panel, and it is this. Sophie, what lessons has the GLA taken from the West London grid constraint crisis to improve future planning and iterations of the London Plan?
Well, firstly, that it's a multi-dimensional issue, that there are many different parties involved and many different solutions, and not all of it lies with planning. Clearly, we have a role to play, and it's already been mentioned, for example, the importance of making data sharing better, and so that everybody is more aware of what's actually going on and what's actually going to happen, whilst allowing for uncertainty. And that early engagement with the distribution networks is also crucial. And I think that it's hugely positive that we're moving to a new system of strategic planning in the energy sector that speaks to the land use and spatial planning system with development plans. But obviously that is going to take a while to bed down. So we're doing our best at the moment, where there is this situation where there's lots of change happening in the wider regulatory system. We're clearly planning for a significant step up in housing numbers, as well as other demands on that electricity network, and so everybody working together, but and working with a systems-wide perspective as well. That you can't just plan for one bit of energy or one energy need. It's got very much, you've got to look at the whole system, the demand side, the supply side, the heat, weight and waste heat aspect of things. As well as the decarbonisation issues. Heating also brings the other dimension, which we've seen a lot of recently, in terms of overheating and the need for cooling. And all these things touch the planning system in various ways. But also there's clearly interfaces with lots of other different systems. So that join up is really important. And I think, as I say, the change in energy strategic planning is hugely positive, but also in London we are particularly advantaged by having the Mayor's Infrastructure Coordination Service to be that go-between and that specialist interface.
And Alec, do you have anything to add from an infrastructure coordination service point of view in terms of lessons learned from the grid constraints?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, the Infrastructure Coordination Service has been very proactive in this space to both provide support to developments that have been stalled in West London, and we've been successful in both coordinating the networks to develop interim solutions, such as the ramping solution that was mentioned in the last panel. It was a very short-term solution. But on top of that, as Sophie said, we are here to really promote better coordination across the wider energy system and doing our best to support better bottom-up perspectives to the data and the demand forecasts that are likely to come forward. And part of the things that we've done as part of that include the local area energy planning that the GLA have been supporting, both at a sub-regional level. So we are looking at doing 4 sub-regional local area energy plans that cover all of London. 3 have been published, and the final one, looking at the 5 outer east boroughs, are due to be published later this year. And that provides more of a bottom-up view around energy demand and what's required to meet decarbonisation objectives across London. Now, there will be borough-led local area energy plans that come forward out of that, of which there's been a substantial number already undertaken with support of the Infrastructure Coordination Service and the GLA Zero Carbon Accelerator Funds to again provide more granular understanding as to energy demands coming forward in the area. The first one we did was in West London because it really responded to that particular need that existed there, and that was taking forward a methodology developed by Energy Systems Catapults and testing out in that area to ensure that we're developing that better forecasting as it comes forward. And then finally, just to address the point on data centres, That is an industry that's very dynamic, is very fast-moving and quite unexpected, as the networks mentioned in the last panel. And in order to address that, we've been progressing on a particular piece of research to look at the data centre industry in London to understand what are the likely growth scenarios that are coming forward, what data points can we leverage to inform better and more coordinated planning on this matter. And that will be developed and published as part of the London Plan evidence as well to ensure that it's providing for that broader view of the sector and how we can plan for it more holistically.
Thank you both. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. My first question is to Sophie. Oh, sorry, it's not. It is to Alec. The GLA's latest update indicates that nearly the entire pipeline of previously stalled permitted housing in the affected West London area has now been unlocked. When do you expect the remaining stalled development to be built out and connected?
Thank you. So, yes, as it currently stands, there are just 3 schemes that we're providing technical support to at the moment. There's 2 residential schemes and 1 non-residential scheme. The GLA doesn't have full visibility of the connection queue, given customer confidentiality. That is something that only the networks are aware of. So while we always advertise our support to the boroughs and developers and various different mailing lists and organisations, we can't be sure as to the level of impact that might exist in West London with other developments that haven't come forward to seek our help. But we would say that the introduction of the ramping solution has been very instrumental in allowing housing schemes to come forward, because it's provided a product that really matches with the way that housing schemes are delivered in a phased way anyway. So in order to match that up, it has allowed a lot of them to come forward that no longer require our support, which has been really proactive and good. And finally, just to add that in terms of our engagements with developers, we are seeing that there's been a real shift in behaviour as well within the development organisations in terms of them taking on board greater energy expertise themselves, reacting to the situation that's happened on the ground. So in many situations, they are able to navigate this complex scenario and use the ramping solution and other products available from SSEN and National Grids to alleviate some of these constraints. So we have found that we're not getting as many inquiries for direct support when it comes from schemes in West London, and we believe that's just a symptom of the success of the ramping solution and some of these other things that have been implemented.
Just a quick supplementary to that. So I wanted to put this to Davina, but Alec and Sophie, you may want to comment. So you've talked about the new schemes that are being, the existing permissions that have been unlocked, which is a positive thing. And presumably those will be built, kind of their internals with compliant boilers and so on. I wonder what support is going in or has gone in for lower income households, so maybe existing households in that particular opportunity area, to replace boilers and the like to make those compliant, because we are going to be switching away from gas boilers to electric, particularly given that heat pumps are quite expensive for somebody on a low income.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. So our project is a heat network project, and ultimately what we're trying to achieve is a network that is delivering a low carbon solution to heating as an alternative to gas boilers. At the moment, we've made pretty good progress in terms of appointing a partner to deliver our network. So we have Hemico working with us, and they are developing the network, dealing with all the sort of statutory consents that need to provide for that network, as well as securing the heat necessary. We're taking that waste heat from data centres. I'm sure we'll come on to that, as well as securing customer connections. So there's an awful lot of work that they're doing at the moment. The first phase of those connections, though, is likely to be bigger buildings and industrial buildings, as well as multi-occupied buildings, so flats, blocks of flats, effectively. And what we don't know at this point is what that sort of cost differential is likely to be, because I think your question is in relation to how the impact of what we're doing might affect lower income households. I can't answer that question right now, because at the moment we know contractually we've put in place within the contract between us and the Hemico, they need to provide the the cost of heat that's lower than what's called the counterfactual. So that's the alternative, effectively, which is individual air source heat pumps on individual buildings. Until we've got through the process and until Hemico have got through the process of actually getting into contract to supply that heat, we won't know the answer to that question. So it's one to watch, I think, and we'll be much clearer on that as we get towards the end of the year.
Well, thank you. I'll just add that in relation to local area energy planning, it takes into account retrofit trajectories within it. So thinking about both the social demographics of particular areas that is looking at the local area energy plan and thinking about what is the energy efficiency rating amongst that building stock and what is likely to be achieved through retrofit as well. So it is being factored into the longer term planning that's undertaken through the local area energy plans being undertaken by the GLA and the boroughs to try and provide a bit more nuance around those particular factors.
Can I just ask you a slightly different question? So you just used the phrase retrofit trajectory. Does that have a specific meaning in your planning?
I believe for the local area energy plans, it was taken into account feedback from the boroughs themselves and which it covers to ensure that it's aligned within that.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. My next question is for Sophie. How is the GLA ensuring that the findings from the local area energy plans are taken up by distribution network operators and reflected in their investment decisions?
Thank you. My understanding is that that is very much something that, again, the Infrastructure Coordination Service is working on, making sure that they're in turn, so they're fed to the network operators and in turn feeding up the chain. Yeah, that's outside of my key area of expertise, I'm afraid.
Is that something either you, Alec, or Davina might want to comment on, to maybe add a bit more meat to that?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to answer. So, yes, in terms of the LAPs sub-regionally as they were produced in tandem with SSEN, UKPN and National Grid as important stakeholders to that process, that they were fully brought into within all of it and have proper oversight as to the approach that was taken, and all outputs were shared with them to ensure that it helps inform the assumptions that feed into their business planning. And in terms of the local borough area energy plans, we've seen good uptake in terms of particularly around SSEN and the Lenser tool that was mentioned. In terms of the local area energy plan that, for instance, OPDC did, some of their more ambitious solar PV projections, for instance, directly fed into how SSEN changed the trajectory of their particular DFES. So we are seeing evidence now of the local area energy plans having a real and meaningful impact on the processes that networks take in terms of determining investment.
Assembly Member Garbutt.
Thank you and afternoon. Sophie, I'm going to come to you first then, Alex. So we heard in our first meeting that the forecast growth in demand in West London is vast over the next decade. How confident are you that we won't experience another capacity constraint again in West London or elsewhere across London?
So again, this is about taking a system-wide approach, we heard a lot in this session earlier today about interrogating the reality of that connection queue. In a similar kind of way, we have to thoroughly interrogate the housing capacity and potential in different parts of London as part of the preparation of the London plan, both in terms of are there development sites, but also in terms of infrastructure capacity. And there's very much should be a sort of feedback loop in the plan-making process where we engage on the point of infrastructure sufficiency and deliverability of any theoretical numbers in any one area to ensure that that is appropriately accounted for in plans by those that have to put that appropriate capacity in place. That said, you know, there are other parts of the jigsaw as well. And we know there's the role of improving energy efficiency in new builds, and clearly building regulations have done a lot with that. We're still awaiting government announcements on the future home standards and expectations there in terms of energy efficiency and also microgeneration like solar power on particular buildings, and also regulations on heat networks and expectations as to when development should be expected to connect. We are working within these processes to try and ensure there's appropriate feedback and that we work through different scenarios and recognise where constraints are, but also the potential for those to move.
Thanks. That's really interesting. So will that regulation be in place? How does that work with the timeline for the London plan with those regulations?
My understanding is we expect an announcement from government this autumn, but that's about as much clarity as I have.
And yeah, just in terms of grid issues persisting, could this mean that thousands of homes are at risk of not being built or businesses being really affected? Like, I'm trying to get a sense from you of what your perception is of the risk now and kind of in the future.
I think we're moving into a space where there's much more proactive, much more of a proactive response in terms of recognising the demands on electricity in West London and across London as a whole that are coming down the pipeline, as it were, with data centres, but also increased housing delivery and general decarbonisation of other processes, including transport. So I'm confident that processes are being put in place. We've just been talking about local area energy plans and the interface of those with more strategic plans coming from a more top-down perspective, as it were. So I think we're in a much better position than we would have been even a few years ago.
Thanks. Alec, do you want to come in there? And then I've got just another follow-up, but seems like a good point to bring you in.
Yep, just to echo Sophie's comments that yes, the local area energy plans that the GLA and the BOAs have been progressing, but also the regional energy strategic plan that's coming forward of NESO, they're all moving towards undertaking more proactive planning where perhaps there wasn't that sort of activity going on so much previously in the past. So I think we're in a much better place to foresee potential issues if they come forward. I would also add that the network's been very proactive in developing new connection solutions. SSEM mentioned the ramping, but also the times connection offers, so it's allowing the network to respond more agilely to development coming forwards. And housing in particular, because it has the ability to be phased, it has the ability to take on board additional net zero or low carbon technologies such as battery storage and solar PV, it's able to really navigate through capacity constraints in a lot more proactive way than, say, much larger single point loads, say data centres that might be looking to connect in the centre of London, for instance. So I would say that from our perspective, we haven't seen evidence of other areas of London that would experience capacity constraints in the same way that West London has historically. And I think partly that is because of the order reforms that have been put in place, the movement towards a more flexible and agile system, not just at the transmission, but at the distribution level, and also because some of these connection products that we mentioned.
That sounds very reassuring. And my final question in this section is related to data centre site energy usage in West London rose from 1.3 gigawatts to 2.2 gigawatts between 23 and 24. So it's just, is that kind of dramatic growth use sustainable? And I guess you've described the things that we're trying to do to review that, but getting a sense of if that's a sustainable growth.
Yeah, and just to say that the data centre forecasting projects that we're doing at the moment is really trying to get to grips with some of those answers to give us better clarity as to what does this mean in terms of future growth, what is achievable, not just in terms of the energy system itself, but also industrial land availability and these other aspects that really underlie why data centres have to be in particular locations. Latency is obviously a really important factor for it, so they are located within particular clusters. And those clusters tend to attract other data centres because of their particular needs around something called availability zoning, where they have to be in certain areas to provide redundancy in relation to their sort of cloud services. So yes, there are particular clusters that have developed in London historically, and data centres have been here for decades. The largest concentration is on the Isle of Dogs, so it's not a new phenomenon, but we would say that the typology of data centres that are now coming forward, they are larger, what we call co-location campus type data centres that tend to request a lot more energy than what we've seen historically. And because they are single development projects themselves, they're a lot more uncertain and a lot harder to sort of pick up in advance of them coming forward as a planning application.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to address my question to Sophie. When will the GLA and the ICS be able to demonstrate that local area energy plans are directly influencing infrastructure delivery in growth areas such as West London?
Thank you. So clearly we're on a trajectory there with the local area energy plans being put in place and them in turn influencing other tiers of strategic planning. My understanding is that the regional level London-wide coverage is almost complete. Borough level with more detail sort of on the ground is in the process of completing. I'm not sure of the precise timescales there, but obviously, and we need to make sure in the London plan that those are given enough attention in local plans that those authorities go on to produce, because I think one of the interesting things is that those local area energy plans don't have a sort of statutory or mandatory position at the moment, but clearly we're all advocating that there does need to be this join up between energy planning and actual development planning. So one thing potentially that the London plan could do, may wish to look at, is how we ensure that join up. But yes, sorry, the timescale thing is not something that's in my gift, or I'm fully over, I'm afraid.
I suppose it's, like you said, it needs time to bed in, doesn't it? This is a whole new thing. And it's interesting you say there's no statutory rule that people have to, a borough would have to fill this in, because the worry would be, right just now it's a zeitgeist, everybody's interested in power, as it were, for umpteen different reasons. But 3 or 4 years down the line, as a cash-strapped local authority, it could slip off. Do you think it would be useful if the London plan, I hesitate to use the word demanded attention in this direction, but heavily suggested that it should be done?
I think if we go back to the kind of things that the London plan has to demonstrate, it has to demonstrate its sound, and ultimately, according to the government's tests set out in national planning policy, and one of those things is around the planning being effective, that you are planning for need, and that the infrastructure needs of those of the housing and employment that you're planning for is going to be supported by appropriate infrastructure. And whilst it's quite difficult in some respects for the planning system to ensure, all kinds of infrastructure is delivered, because there's a huge range of different mechanisms by which infrastructure is delivered, and some of it is subject, as we were hearing earlier, to a wider regulatory system. There are certain mechanisms that are more in our gift, and one of those is to suggest to local plans what it's helpful for them to attend to in making sure their infrastructure is aligned with the more detailed growth plans that they set out in a local plan.
It's interesting because as a nation we're always accused of being centralised, and on the one thing we probably should be centralised on, it seems like we've just arrived at the notion recently. And when London is doing these plans, are they affected by the wider region? Because obviously London often is perceived as an island, but from a power generation connection point of view, is that the case? And would it be, in a perfect world, would it be more useful to have these conversations with the surrounding counties as well, or is that not necessary? And that's for anyone who feels like they could take that on.
Yep, I'm happy to say that. So in terms of how the network is obviously organised, National Grid covers the whole of the UK, so any planning they do at that transmission level would undertake that entire geographic area. In terms of London, there are obviously 2 distribution network operators who have very different geographies as well, in terms of UKPN stretching out to Essex and Kent, and SSEN going all the way down to Southampton. So really the role of the Infrastructure Coordination Service is trying to facilitate better coordination at that regional London level through the local area energy plans and other matters, and our engagement with the regional energy strategic planner as well. I think in terms of the London region, we are very cognizant that there are things that happen on the outskirts of London that can have an impact on that. And that is basically a factor of the way the network is structured. For instance, National Grid's grid supply point for half of Hillingdon also covers all of Slough, which is another major data centre cluster. So growth in Slough will have an impact on energy availability on parts of Hillingdon, and that's something that we're very cognizant about. and making sure that we factor into some of our planning assumptions to ensure that it's reasonable and robust.
Okay, thank you. Chair.
Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair. My first question is to our OPDC representative, so I'm not sure if it'll be Davina or Stephen, so decide among yourselves. So it's about, you sent in a response to our call for evidence and you said that continued lobbying of National Grid and the government to bring forward upgrades and reform to the way power is allocated to developments should be prioritised. So could you talk us through what upgrades and reforms you would like to see? Could you expand on the...
Can I hand that one over to my colleague, actually?
You can indeed,
Steve,
yes.
who's online.
You're on.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
You can.
Yeah, happy to take that question. So it really relates to strategic planning. And I think colleagues earlier and I think in the earlier session, the energy companies talked about strategic planning and the importance of actually planning ahead, medium and long term. So it's really understanding how energy companies, National Grid, DNOs, and other stakeholders can actually plan longer term to anticipate the increasing capacity requirements. And yeah, I certainly would echo what's been said earlier, that there is evidence to show that certainly DNOs, National Grid, are beginning to see the importance of that strategic planning. The conduit to that is the local area energy plan that OPDC have prepared, and that sort of sets out the need to, well, first of all, the fact that the grid capacity currently is not there in the long term, and coupled with that, the need to decarbonise and look at energy efficient modes of delivering power to development. So it's a case of engaging with those stakeholders and ensuring that they understand the requirements and the ramping requirements in terms of power for developments like the OPDC development area.
Okay, thanks very much. My next couple of questions are going to be about microgrids. So, Sophie, we've heard during our investigation that microgrids should be supported in the next London plan. So could you talk us through what the GLA's current thinking is about how smart or microgrids could play a role in the future as part of the next London plan?
So, yeah, as we've partly touched on earlier, that obviously taking a whole systems approach means accounting for different sources of supply, both clearly what's planned for on a big national scale, transmission scale, and others that can be input to the grid more locally, and recognising that renewables, particularly solar, have a good potential in London, but also heat networks. I guess I don't know fully the technicalities of what terms, where a microgrid ends and where a heat network, whether there's overlap, but those are part of the jigsaw as well. So, and clearly, that's not just about capacity constraints. It's also, in a sort of absolute terms, it's also about providing that flexibility where there are peaks in demand to be managed, and you can factor in battery storage and things as part of that, but also the resilience if certain things at a national level are problematic. The wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine. You've got these other sources that may be more localised, including heat recovery from things like water sources that can all contribute to the system keeping functioning.
Thank you. Is there anything more you can say about practically how the London plan potentially could support the development of microgrids?
Again, this is quite a difficult point in time to ask that question because we are awaiting this clarity from government about what the national expectation is. Yeah. And clearly it's preferable for there to be consistency at national level, so everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. So that's probably as far as I can go at the moment. We've got a watching brief on it as an issue, and clearly, you know, if national regulation doesn't fill the space we expect it to, need it to, from a sort of energy sufficiency and perspective, then that is a consideration in the formation of planning policy.
So that's something that potentially the London Plan would do some more work on if it wasn't done. Okay, thank you. And again, back to OPDC, on microgrids, what's stopping the OPDC from rolling out microgrids? Do you think is there not? Do you not have an appetite for it, or is there not an appetite on the ground, or is there sort of technical support that could be given, or is there something else entirely that's not facilitating that?
I can answer that one. So we've got a huge appetite for this, actually. So the only thing that will stop us, I guess, is progress on the ground, because ultimately we did some initial feasibility testing. This would have been back in 2017 to look at the feasibility of putting solar on rooftops. Yeah. And in some ways it was a successful project because we identified that there was clearly demand. But it was the cost of that installation alongside the capacity to actually get onto the grid that, you know, meant that it was quite difficult to actually roll that project out. So fast forward to, you know, the local area energy planning that very clearly identifies that smart local energy systems can help to relieve some of the pressure on the grid. You know, we have now been supported through the GLA's Zero Carbon Accelerator programme with financial support to actually develop a microgrid within Park Royal. And that will rely on solar power, of which there are plenty of rooftops that can provide that, but also using battery storage, incorporating electric vehicle charging, incorporating all sorts of sort of flexibility around demand to make sure that we've got, it almost acts as a bit of a safety valve so that, you know, we know that grid reinforcement is coming, but that's in the 2030s. This is an interim solution that we hope can address some of the issues that have been raised, not just in this session, but also in the session previously. Yeah. So it's a concept that we're actively working on. We're right at the start of that, taking on board all of the recommendations from the LEAP as well as our previous feasibility work. Yeah. So watch this space, I think, is what I can say on that.
That's good. That's good. But sort of relate to my question to Sophie, if there was more, when we get more national or regional clarity on that, that would certainly enable you to go further.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to come to Davina and Stephen on this. We have heard from previous guests that data centre operations can be very conservative about risk. What lessons would you share from getting data centres around the table to commit to heat networks in Park Royal?
I can start on this. So I think for us, we started talking to the data centres again 2-3 years ago, but it was really clear that, you know, their operation involves an awful lot of IT kit that gets very, very hot. They have to cool this kit down. They've got to do that somehow. And actually that has an energy impact by itself because you've got to cool the equipment. There's a cost to that. When you think about their sustainability goals, their sustainability objectives, when you marry that together with the cost of actually cooling that equipment, if we can take that waste heat from them, it's a kind of win-win for both because we're meeting their sustainability targets, but we're also doing something with that waste heat that's useful. So actually we realised quite early on, if you can get that sort of sweet spot when they're in the right stage of planning, and for us, the data centres where we have commitment to take their heat, they're the ones that are actually in construction. So you haven't got a retrofit situation to deal with. It's a win-win for both sides. So actually the conversations have progressed really positively for us from a sort of heat extraction perspective.
So are you actively out there courting this, saying to people, if you're going to set up a data centre within our purview, we would like to, you know, extract that heat, provide a heat network, or at least look at that possibility? If I was building a data centre today, would I be able to get that information from you? Would it be easy to come by? Is it a possibility?
So it's not mandated that data centres have to provide heat. That's the one thing that, you know, and Sophie alluded to this earlier, the legislation around heat networks, that will make it really clear who has to provide, which heat sources have to provide heat and which buildings have to connect. We don't have clarity on that yet. That will come when secondary legislation finally lands, which we're anticipating at some point next year. I think for us, it's more, we haven't curated this necessarily. You know, we don't have this sort of, I guess, the landscape that our Canadian, sorry, not Canadian, what am I talking about? Our Scandinavian partners in this will have, where they have broad greenfield sites where they've actively planned for the location of that data centre. They've planned for a heat network, and it all ties together. So it's seen as one thing. We haven't done that yet here, and I think that's coming. But in tightly constrained brownfield sites like ours, I think it's quite difficult to do that planning and to actually realise that as a joined-up strategy. It doesn't happen as easily.
To what extent will legislation change that? Because legislation can't change the physicality of the city that you're dealing with. So will it be a little help, a major help?
It will give clarity. I think it will give clarity on who needs to connect and who needs to provide heat from a heat source. That's what I think it will give clarity on, which we don't currently have at the moment.
Okay. Alec, please, everybody, please feel the right to come in on this question. We've heard from the GLA. We have heard that the GLA should explore data centres. In fact, I'm going to skip that question because I feel like you've sort of answered that and go straight to a different question. Given the critical role that data centres are going to play in London's future growth, should the next London plan include separate data centre policy to facilitate more strategic approach?
Thanks. Again, I mean, this is something that's encouraged by the National Planning Policy Framework at the moment as part of planning for growth, that it's helpful to give clarity as to where data centres would be best located. There are some complexities to that relating to planning use class and sort of some legal uncertainty as to how much control of what types of data centre we have through planning. But certainly it is something we're actively investigating, as was signalled by the Towards a New London Plan consultation that posed that question as well and sought views on it.
You talked about complexities and difficulties. Do you feel they're just because this is a sort of a new field? Do you think they can be bottomed out, or will that complexity always be there and just have to be dealt with? Because planning, you could argue in and of itself, is quite complex, but it does deal with, I mean, we build nuclear power stations. A data centre can't be any more complicated than that. So is it just a case of we haven't done it that many times and a few goes and we'll know what we're doing?
Partly, clearly, it's a relatively new phenomenon, and the nature of data centres is evolving, and the demand for them is evolving with increased AI, for example. So it's a bit of a moving picture, but as ever thus with planning, there's always new uses that come into the picture, and you somehow have to get across that likelihood of that uncertainty and that likelihood of change, and provide enough parameters that direct what you can, whilst also engaging with other bodies that can give direction and clarity, including the government.
Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Boff.
Ms Wilson, when we're talking about district heat networks, to what extent can those networks incorporate customer choice? Because to date, they haven't been very good in allowing customers to choose. Well, they can't. In some, for technical reasons, they can't choose suppliers. The transparency has been poor, and regulation has been equally light. I know there's changes taking place. Is that lack of customer choice going to feature in the way in which heat networks are designed in the future?
So I think from an OPDC perspective, we're not a concession, so there's no exclusivity around what we're doing with Hemico. I think that's the first point. The second, I would say, is that Ofgem have been appointed as the regulator, and heat networks have been unregulated in this country to date. So that regulation will take effect, from what I understand, from January next year. So that will have an impact, because clearly Ofgem will be able to ensure that pricing is set at a level that is reasonable. There is the supplier of last resort provisions within that. So if a company goes bust, you've got somewhere to go with your heat network operator. And there are minimum technical standards that need to be achieved. I think some of this is market-driven, isn't it, in terms of, where networks are situated and their customer base. But I suppose the distinction for us is that, and I'll go back to my first point, we are not a concession here. So there is choice, I guess, if that's the nature of your question. We're not an area that has sort of mandated that you must connect within this particular area. As yet, zoning regulations will change that, because you'll be familiar with zoning regulations that are coming into effect at some point next year.
So the people who will use your networks will have choice whether or not they use those networks.
The people who use these networks will have...
In your area will choose whether or not they can use you.
Yeah, so the first phase of customers are buildings who have been offered the choice of connecting to this network, and if a financial deal is made, they will connect to this network.
Thank you very much indeed.
Just to come to Sophie, what is the GLA doing to ensure that data centre waste heat can be used as a source of low-carbon heat for London, and kind of expanding out on schemes like the one in OPDC? And do we need secondary legislation to do something like mandate data centres to provide a waste heat network in order to achieve planning permission in London?
So, yeah, this is one of the things that Davina alluded to there. We're waiting for clarity on from the government about how heat network zoning will be used to mandate both sort of connection to a heat network as a heat supply, but also as a waste heat offtake mechanism for certain producers, large-scale producers of waste heat. So the working assumption is that that will be dealt with at a national level, and there will be expectations set out for heat over a certain level, as it were, scale, and therefore strategic significance will be mandated to connect to heat networks. If it isn't, then obviously that's a consideration for us to think about, given that, as I said, we need to plan for the energy system as a whole in London to account for its growth needs.
So if, as you said, that's the expectation, but say that doesn't come to fruition, could that be something we look at on a London basis via the London plan?
Yes, it would be something we would look at.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you very much. I was just thinking of, I think it's a DHN in my constituency at Bun Hill, which takes heat off Old Street and the Northern Line, and that's distributed to some of the estates and other properties close to Old Street. So maybe there are examples of what the GLA is already doing that could be shared. Appreciate that you're waiting for national clarity, but there's already some good practice I've seen. But my question really, so on this is to you, Sophie, but again, if anybody else would like to come in, you're very welcome to do so. On the 26th of June, this committee heard from guests, particularly London Borough of Hillingdon, and they expressed a concern that a developer might build a warehouse and then see it subsequently be turned into a data centre. And I wondered what your views are on a separate use class. So the data centres and warehouses are both B8 use class. So a separate use class for data centres compared to those warehouses. I think the representative from Hillingdon just said that there would be absolutely nothing they could do in planning terms if that were to happen. And obviously there are constraints on land availability in that borough and in other places.
Thank you. Yeah, this I alluded to earlier, that there is some uncertainty as to the planning classification, the use classes classification of data centres and different types of data centres. And I don't fully claim to understand the technicalities of this, but sometimes there's taken to be a division between what's in the same category as warehouses and what's in a class of its own, known in planning as sui generis. Undoubtedly, it would be helpful if there could be clarity on this, because it's always it is very hard to plan for, whilst clearly data centres are part of planning for economic growth and the needs of the economy as is set out in the London Growth Plan, and as is warehousing. Clearly they have very different impacts, infrastructure requirements, and knock-on implications. So being able to be more precise in both planning policy and in turn how that is assessed in the case of particular applications, and the fact that there would be a planning application requirement for a change of use in that circumstance would be helpful. I would never argue that it would be unhelpful given the clear differentiation there between the likely infrastructure impacts.
If I could just add, in terms of some of the research that we're doing with the data centre industry, they have recognised that given the shifts in the types of data centre typologies that are coming forwards, this move towards much larger, more intensive ones, it is far more difficult to try and retrofit an existing warehouse to meet those kind of very strict requirements they have around redundancy, particularly with the need for backup generators, for proper cooling equipment. It's not a simple thing to turn a warehouse into a functioning data centre that will be up to the standards that a lot of the operators are trying to build at. So that's why we're not seeing, from our perspective, recently, many sort of larger new data centres come forward through permitted development in existing warehouses. They tend to need to be their own bespoke building typology these days.
Okay, but thank you for that. I guess even if that is the case, that people are developers of new data centres are taking kind of a best-in-class approach. In terms of the broad principle, would it not be helpful to not have them as kind of, as you've said, kind of yet another sui generis building type, and just have some specificity around how they can be used or kind of permitted or not? I mean, I think that would be something that would be really helpful in terms of managing land and space in the capital.
Yes, absolutely. Anything that improves the transparency, that allows us to understand how data centre growth is coming forward, would be very helpful, not just for spatial planning, but also in our engagement with the networks on more holistic and coordinated energy planning. And that is something that the Data Centre Forecasting Project is trying to do by identifying these additional data gaps that we need to fill and getting a better understanding as to the likely impacts of, say, data centres coming forwards via prior approval in existing warehouses is one question that we're asking at the moment, and trying to build better evidence base and data around.
Just turn back to OPDC for a second. We've spoken about the permission for the data centre there. Just, do you have any feedback on how the process has been for them acquiring suitable power?
Steve, is this one that you could comment on?
I won't be able to speak to that, unfortunately. I'm not quite sure. We've not really been directly involved with in discussions with regards to the data centres and securing power. And we know as a matter of course, data centres tend to reach out quite early on, well in advance of any planning process in terms of securing power. And that's probably one of the issues that potentially transpire further down the line with development, that a lot of those discussions have happened with the DNOs and data centres quite early on. So I think it's quite important from our perspective to have better understanding, perhaps through the planning process, of what those requirements are for data centres, because, you know, as Alec was alluding to earlier, they play directly into long-term strategic planning for capacity. So that's what we would definitely like to see a little bit more of.
Thank you very much for that. Assemblymember Garbett.
Thank you. Just turning to housing, so Sophie, I wondered what consideration is being given to regarding the capacity constraints faced by West London boroughs when calculating their housing contribution in the next London plan, and how infrastructure is considered in the, I was going to read their whole names because I'm trying to avoid all the acronyms, but the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment and the Strategic Housing Market Assessment. So the first question is about the housing contribution in the London plan, and then how infrastructure is considered in those?
Yeah, so the most relevant one is what's known as the SHLAR, so the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment. The other one you mentioned is more of an assessment of housing need. So the Housing Land Availability Assessment is essentially what some people would describe as a capacity study. So, and as I say, there's a process of working out how many homes can be delivered where in London and when. So that's it is a technical exercise involving an understanding of lots of physical constraints, including things like flood risk, for example, and environmental protections, which are potentially more absolute constraints. But then it's taken into the plan-making process as an input to what I'm also working on as another part of my role, which is the development of London's spatial strategy. So how London will need to grow and change to accommodate the scale of needs we've got. And so that's looked at on a pan-London basis, understanding the options and different combinations of types of growth and different sources of growth. And as part of evaluating those options, factors of infrastructure sufficiency and deliverability in terms of planned ways to overcome the extent to which those are constraints at the moment are accounted for. So it's very much part of the wide range of considerations that will be accounted for at the London-wide level, and that is then that London-wide level, if you like, is what becomes is parcelled into different housing targets for different boroughs.
Thank you. So first question, when's the spatial strategy going to be available? Is that soon?
Spatial strategy is a fundamental part of the draft plan, so it will be set out in the draft plan next year.
And so what you were just saying then, that it's a planned way to overcome, so then is it not is not considered a barrier then? So the constraints in West London wouldn't be... Yeah, if you could just talk specifically about the constraints in that West London are facing and how it might contribute to their contribution to the housing target.
So I think we were hearing earlier about the number of ways and interventions that are occurring in the West London area to better plan for growth and different ways of dealing with that. And some of that is clearly about physical changes to the actual infrastructure. Some of it is about managing demand, and some of it is about plugging in other sources of supply, as we were just talking about in terms of microgrids. So it's a sort of iterative process that you don't just say clearly we know there's a problem in West London, but that's not the end of the exploration process that has to go on. We have to investigate to what extent and by how much can those constraints be overcome, and more importantly, when, because in the last, it is typical to plan for 10 years worth of housing targets in the London plan, even though we have a sort of strategic look ahead for longer than that. And clearly you don't want to be assuming more housing can be delivered if the timing of the infrastructure capacity constraints being dealt with doesn't coincide with that.
Yeah, because I think that's what Alec mentioned earlier about housing projects were able to be phased, and I think obviously we're really keen to get the housing we need as quickly as possible. So it is interesting to understand how that dynamic works. So, yeah, and how would it lead to a situation where there would be a recommendation around phasing because of the infrastructure constraints?
Potentially. In any case, sort of phasing tends to happen naturally within a development, given that there's only so many homes that can be built at any one time in an area. So there's sort of physical and workforce constraints on development build-out rates. But yeah, in demonstrating, as I say, we'll have to do down the line that our plan is robust, is sound. We will the importance of that timing will come into the spotlight, and that may be something that we may wish to specify and look at, but it's too early to say at the moment.
Thank you. And then just to super clarify, just in terms of, so you're saying that where the housing will go is driven primarily by need, and we'd aim to get over the constraints, but obviously the constraints are a consideration, but it is primarily driven by the need.
No, it's driven by the capacity, and so the need is what is the sort of 88,000 a year that the government has assessed according to the national standard methodology of assessing housing need. So that's the sort of big number, if you like, that we're working to distribute through an understanding of capacity. That's clearly about the availability of particular development sites of different kinds, but it's sort of moderated by an understanding of infrastructure.
Thank you. And Alec, just if you wanted to add anything, and just any comment on if the capacity constraints would be a barrier to delivering large housing projects in West London?
From the evidence that we've seen in conversation we've had with developers now, we don't believe that the capacity constraints are going to be a barrier to significant housing delivery in the west of London. Working with them to pilot a new product called Community Smart Access, where if housing integrates low carbon technologies within their design, it allows them to come forward at an accelerated rates if they are in an area that is facing capacity constraints, by essentially using the technologies that are there to essentially balance their demands over time. So there are all sorts of solutions that are in place to help housing come forward in the affected area, and as long as the housing developments can take advantage of those solutions, we don't see that there would be a problem in the short term in terms of housing delivery as it comes forward.
Thank you, and thanks for that example. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is to you, Alec, and it kind of follows on from what you've already been talking about, but the Upgrading London's infrastructure plan and the framework, who's actually been consulted on that, and how's that being worked through? And I know it refers, I think, to some pilot identification schemes. Perhaps you could outline what that means, and again, how that's kind of being implemented, please.
Yep. So the Upgrading London infrastructure mandates, I'm afraid it's something above my seniority in terms of the process and how that's gone about. I understand that it's been adopted at this point, but in terms of the specific aspects that you were mentioning within the mandates around piloting, I believe that relates to future-proofing piloting that we're looking to develop as part of our new, more proactive programme. Since the Infrastructure Development Service has been very successful in alleviating schemes in a reactive way that have come forward with issues, we're now trying to move to explore more proactive approaches that we can take, both as the GLA and the wider GLA group, in where do we intervene within the development process to ensure that schemes don't face utility connection issues into the future. So that is thinking about all sorts of things from microgrids that was mentioned earlier, but also additional new connection products that could be developed, as well as the GLA position on forthcoming and ongoing connection reform. And as the first panel mentioned, while connection reform has been underway significantly for generation, that is now moving into looking at connection reform on a demand side. So housing and commercial businesses coming forward, and what reforms could be done to the connection process at the distribution level to ensure they don't face similar issues moving forward. So really that's a piece of work within that, is trying to undertake some more research, piloting and understanding as to what more we can be doing in the space to ensure that we're being very proactive looking forward.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question, and I guess this might sort of pull together various things that have been discussed across the session and the previous session, but sort of taking everything in the round, are you confident that West London can realistically accommodate all of these things that are likely to be coming forward? So more data centres, more housing, EV charging, and hopefully also a third runway at Heathrow. Can all that be delivered within this system?
I would say that the key to all of this is really coordination and recognising that the system is really in a state of flux across both regulation at the national level as well. So I think we're really cognizant about the substantial growth ambitions that West London has that you've mentioned, and we're making sure that proper projections of that demand is taken into account into these new strategic planning processes, which are at a very early stage and are going to develop over the next 2 years as we move into the regional energy strategic plan and other aspects. So our role is really to make sure that the transparency and the coordination of all those growth ambitions are properly factored into energy planning by the networks as well. So that's essentially the actions that we're trying to take to ensure that we get the outcome that London requires.
So hopefully that's a yes. No, that's great. Thank you. Back to the chair.
My question is to Sophie. Amsterdam had a similar problem in terms of the proliferation of data centres, and they held a one-year moratorium on new data centres until they managed to increase their capacity. I think the AI growth zones in some ways are a policy of directing development of data centres to areas where there is enough capacity to meet their needs. Is that something you think the GLA should support?
Clearly, the work on that has been done at a national level, and it makes sense to have that sort of national strategic picture for something that's clearly features heavily in the government's plans for growth. What that means in practice and whether it, and hopefully it will appropriately take account of all the work that we've already been discussing from local area energy plans and their more strategic equivalents, so that there is this join up and it is based on a proper understanding both of capacity is going to be critical.
Alec, would you have anything to add on that? Or?
Yep, just to echo Sophie's comments, that those decisions that you spoke about in Amsterdam obviously occurring at the national level, and the decision for NESO and the national grids in terms of that. The networks have a statutory duty to provide a connection offer to anyone who requests it. So it's unlikely that we'll see a scenario where people will be outrightly refused a connection, since the networks don't have that statutory right within it. But in terms of the data centre growth, as we sort of mentioned, we really think that's this new project that we're undertaking around the forecasting will really help us better plan for both what's needed and understanding of what's coming down the pipeline, to ensure that we don't get into similar situations as happen in West London, and that we're able to sort of properly plan and coordinate data centre growth in a way that it doesn't have an impact on the broader energy system or broader growth priorities that might occur in local areas.
We've now reached the end of the session. I would like to thank our guests for your attendance and contributions today. The committee has a few more brief items of business to deal with, but in the meantime, you're welcome to leave the room or remain seated to observe our ongoing proceedings. And thank you again. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 25-26 Assembly year? The next meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee will take place on the 22nd of October 2025 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting.